Thank you for joining us today. I never take for granted when you take time away from your busy schedule to join us, and I always endeavor to make sure we deliver with some really great content for you. And today is no exception. We have the pleasure today of talking with Mike Hassel, and we're going to be talking about negotiating to restore balance in a polarized world. And everybody's talking about it being so polarized, so you're going to get some solutions and insights on that today. So welcome, Mike. I can't wait for the conversation.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know Mike, he's the author of Deep Tradeoffs, Restoring Balance and Respect in a Polarized, Angry World. Sound familiar? So again, I think you're in for a real treat today. After a decade getting degrees in engineering, business, and liberal arts from Georgia Tech, Harvard, no less, and Vanderbilt, Mike co-founded Knowledge Products. They produced over 140 titles on, those great ideas of history. And then he spent another 2 decades sort of reading and studying and writing about all of the inconsistent values and principles that are found in all of these diverse areas of interest that we read about. So, why don't you kickstart us off? What was the inspiration for Deep Tradeoffs, your latest book?
When I was 40, I had an aha moment in this publishing business. We had done philosophy and science and religion and political thought, and we were doing a series on moral problems of our age.
Mm,
And it just struck me that trained as a scientist, the techniques I have for understanding and solving problems did not apply to these moral problems. They
mhm.
weren't problems in the sense that I understood problems to be. There's no formula, there was no algorithm, there's no structured decision process. There was nothing to resolve these things, but rather these were separately valid and true things that were in conflict, and they couldn't all be realized fully. They had to be a give and take between them. So I've come to call these deep trade-offs because they're deeper than pro and con, strength and weaknesses, cost benefit, the things we deal with every day. They probe more deeply into our cherished values that we end up fighting over.
Yeah.
And so part of the ways of dealing with this is to understand this is a management problem, not a scientific problem that some scientist is going to solve for us by doing research. Uh,
Yeah.
None of these are solvable that way.
I love that. Nothing better than having an aha moment later in life, right? I gotta love when those
Yes.
things hit. Wait, so just clarify for us then, like if you were gonna say define for us what a deep trade-off is, what would that be?
It is a conflict in values that cannot be resolved, but has to be managed.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Nicely.
So a good example, I mean, we know all of these, but they're more subconscious in our recognition. For instance, everybody's for equality. What decent person is not for equality? By the way, I said that to a friend, and she's Palestinian, and she said, "I know some people in the Middle East who don't believe in it." So, so everything
That's timely.
could be is a trade off,
Yeah.
but there's a definite trade-off with liberty. If you're going to get more equality, you're going to impinge
Yeah.
people's liberty.
Yeah.
And we were founded as a country based in liberty, and
Yeah.
so there's a balance between those two things. We say in our creeds that we want liberty and justice,
Yeah.
and we want equality and mercy, but those things compete.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh gosh. As a social justice attorney for over 30 years, that is totally resonating with me. I can tell you, Mike, my goodness, you think freedom of speech, right? Again, these are obvious kinds of things, and yet
Yes.
we have such deep conflicts about it, and we're seeing those really raise their ugly head today. So, and so let's dig into that in today's
Okay.
divided world. What are some steps that we can take to connect sort of through our differences?
There's several books and programs out there that talk about processes for how to do this. It's mostly about politeness, understanding the difference between civility and politeness. There's a whole book on that. There's discovery and questioning rather than telling. They're all really good pieces of advice,
Yeah.
but I think of them as more process oriented.
Yeah.
And my fourth chapter, a few people read early drafts and said, "What do I do about this deep trade off thing?" So I wrote a fourth chapter that's a compilation of about 100 of those different kinds of tactics and procedures,
Yeah.
basically. What I'm trying to get at is a deeper understanding of conflicting values that helps us see symmetry in the world and to recognize the need for balance and backing off of this insistence on right and wrong.
Yeah.
That one side
Yeah.
is not right, the other side is not wrong. They are both right in different proportions, in different
Yeah.
circumstances, and in different mindsets.
Yeah.
And to balance that, we have to work with other people. And one of the really great conclusions that come from that is friendship comes before solving problems.
Oh,
We don't solve problems and become friends because we've reached agreement. We first have to be friends, and then maybe I'll come a little your way, maybe you'll come a little way my way. And my favorite way of saying that is we're not shoved into agreement, we're loved into it.
Oh, I love that. That's beautiful. And I mean, so much of this disagreement comes from our perceptions about truth, and everybody's so convinced about their truth. So what are some of the myths out there, do you think, or misconceptions at least about truth?
It's a fantastic question. Of course, it's a big philosophical question. And my third chapter is on honesty and deception. We all think that truth is our ultimate value, that we insist on it and demand it. And well, it's not. We'd rather survive than tell the truth.
Yeah.
You know, that's pretty reliable. And we'd rather eat, than not eat. If we have to lie to get food, people will do that. So this is, we all would recognize that if we told it, right? But we will say in a different circumstances, truth trumps everything. Yeah. Well, we deceive ourselves all the time about our reality, how good our marriage is, how well we're doing and doing our part to make it better. So my third chapter is on deception, and nobody can read that chapter without recognizing how many ways we fall short in being fully honest.
Right? Yeah, I'm cringing as you're saying it. It's true.
Yeah, but the part of that is that sometimes it's right to intentionally deceive. That's the deception of a lie. Yeah. Okay, we deceive our kids about Santa Claus, but we do it to bring them joy, right? Yeah. We deceive somebody who's deathly ill, or let's say they've served us a bad meal. Say nice things and pretend that we enjoyed it because we don't want to hurt their feelings. We deeply wound them, right? Meet somebody that's ugly and has bad breath, you're not likely to quite admit to full transparency on that, right? And it just comes with tact and just common decency. So the discussion here, getting these deep trade-offs, is to recognize there are compelling dualities, dual sides to things that if we think about, we see them all over the place, and it's our opportunity to manage that tension.
Yeah, nice. And not to mention, I mean, we all have different experiences of things. And as I get older, I mean, as a lawyer, you're so conditioned. It's like your position is the right position, that right and wrong and conflicting in that competition about it. And yet often witnesses, and we'll badger them and, get them crying on the witness stand that they're not telling the truth. But we can all engage in the same activity and come away with dramatically different experiences and perceptions about it. So, what is truth with a capital T? And do you find there are similar myths about people and their behavior?
Yes, because people defend their beliefs because they want them to be true. We believe what we wish to be true.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. And we cherry pick evidence to say that is a correct belief. It might be true that being kind and honest is not the best way to get ahead in life, depending on what you think getting ahead is. Right? I don't happen to think that, but, let me put it this way. One of my favorite ways of thinking about this duality of truths, that there are competing truths. If I ask you the question, what is the meaning of life? Yeah. It's been asked hundreds of times. It's impossible to answer. Yeah. It suggests that there is an answer. Yeah. Right. If I ask you, where do you find meaning in life? Oh, my family, my work, my dreams, there's a bunch of answers, and they're different for you, they're different for me. And I think of truth that way, that we just have to ask the right question and back off of this idea that there's one right answer and anything that conflicts with it is wrong.
Yeah. And I love being open to reframing things. I mean, that's a big part of what's motivated me to this new life, the art of feminine negotiation and negotiating our best life. Even something as simple as success, I mean, how we define success. We've been conditioned to define success based on a very sort of competitive, fiscally driven sort of approach. But what if we define success as something altogether different? I mean, the outcomes then dramatically change. And when we're talking about truth, I mean, a lot of people associate sort of truth in our convictions about that. And I know you've said, it really caught my attention, that conviction closes mind. So I'd love if you could go a little deeper, explain what that means.
So when I was doing knowledge products on these great ideas of history, we ran across this quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, who's most famous for saying God is dead and some other things like that. He was talking about the decline of religious conviction in the late 1800s. And the lack of confidence in some of the ways those stories had been told. But he also said conviction is a worse enemy of truth than lies. And I thought that just doesn't make sense. Convictions are, I thought they were somewhat short of truth, but stronger than belief. They had more evidence for them. That was kind of my hierarchy in my mind. What he was saying is that convictions make us unwilling to listen to challenges to that.
Yeah.
It's not what you know that's untrue. It's what you don't know. Right.
Yeah.
It's not true. That's
what
not
you
true.
Think that.
Yeah. And so conviction closes us off from those kinds of ways to improve. Yeah. And anybody who thinks that their beliefs are 100% correct is either dead or or perfect. And we know that people are not perfect.
Yeah. And I want to really put a pin in that for our listeners out there. I want you to really think about that yourself and in your life, because I think it is one of the single largest struggles that we're facing today as a civilization, not to be overly dramatic, but, with social media and the way that it's feeding to us, where we get confirmation bias repeatedly because we're getting fed more and more of things that we already believe. And we seem to be shutting down our capacity, our willingness, our openness to listen to each other. So, and I know it's a touchy subject, but COVID, we really saw that. If there was ever a time that we really needed to have the most meaningful possible dialogue, that was one of it. And yet everybody became so polarized and absolutely convinced about the correctness of their position, notwithstanding that the experts were dealing with it afresh. So I think you've really hit on such an important topic. Now, I know you've also
can I add one thing here?
Absolutely, please do.
Really important thing to understand here is that disagreement is stitched into the human condition, particularly in free societies. People have asked me, did this problem start with Trump? It had a definite political orientation to that question, but no, it started hundreds of years ago with people who understood that interests divide into factions, and you check and balance them so nobody gets their hands on the steering wheel and tyrannizes other people. That was their chief worry. Right. So the point is, disagreement is not the problem. It's an opportunity. The problem is coercion.
Yeah. Yeah. And just before you go there, I know as soon as you said disagreement, you said, I know one of the things that you had said is that we can't and shouldn't end disagreement. So talk about that. And then I love this coercion versus disagreement. So.
Yeah, well, this is the way we grow and get better. Consultants at McKinsey work in teams on the principle that people are very poor critics of their own thinking. Yeah. They believe it, they think it, so your friend has to tell you what's the weakness in it, and you have to be friendly enough with them to listen. So that translates to this idea that we're not shoved into change, we're not pushed and argued into it, we're loved into it. So we make friends first, and then we come together based on a good faith and affection. At least decency and respect, if not affection. Disagreement is not new. Polarization is not new. And in my book, I talk about some awful situations in the early United States. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams ran against each other, and one called the other a witch. Reign of witches. It was Jefferson said about Adams. Adams said he's a hermaphrodite. Mulatto. A racial insult, a gender insult. And it's not new.
Yeah. And in fact, we don't grow. I know that's what you say. I want to really, again, put a pin in that for our listeners there. I mean, if we don't allow ourselves the space to disagree, then we're never going to have the opportunity for growth. And, Google and certainly some of the big players out there have done studies as well. That's why you need and want that diversity of thinking, diversity of background. You're going to get better outcomes, more creative solutions, and
look how boring it would be.
Yes, exactly. If we all just thought the same thing all the time. Absolutely. Now, and talk a little bit about, I had cut you off about that coercion piece when you'd said, look, it's not the disagreement, it's coercion.
So one of the conflicts is liberty and equality. Okay. I happen to be really big on liberty because I think it's consistent with the vision that our founders had for the kind of country we have, for diversity. And we've met all kinds of people and beliefs. And the problem becomes when we pretend that there's one way of being and that we're going to make everyone be that way. You see that in cancel culture. You see that in a lot of the dynamics on social media, where they're going to shut down people that disagree with us. It's damaging and unhealthy. And so I like to redirect attention to the force involved rather than persuasion. That's another trade-off I'll be writing in the future. Is there are times to use force. We use force with our kids sometimes when we've run out of other options, but persuasion is generally much better. And you can probe deeply also into what philosophers call epistemology. What do we know and what do we not know? In the end, truth is pretty elusive.
Yeah.
It's tentative and it's subject to change, and the absolutes don't come to us. They're
Yeah.
really
Well,
not there.
you're preaching my language. You're preaching to the choir here. I mean, obviously,
Okay.
that the art of feminine negotiation and the art of persuasion about where we try and let's reframe conflict. And you said the word. I often say that let's reframe conflict as a beautiful opportunity, right? And I'm glad you called out with this whole cancel culture, because I think there's such great risks, and I don't hear people talking about it. And even as a social justice attorney, obviously I leaned a particular way on
Right.
the political spectrum, but even I sit back and I look at a lot of that culture now saying, well, we do this. It's almost like we're swinging the pendulum in a way that's equally as destructive to the very things they're purporting. I mean, the kind of censorship that we saw in Nazi Germany. I mean, what's next? Comedians who can't, I mean, so many of the things that were really important, difficult issues to be able to have discussions about, we were able to have through comedy historically. And now it's getting more and more difficult to even have a light shone on these things through comedy, because everybody's so terrified of being canceled. So,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah. Now, do you have any advice or tips on how you would suggest we negotiate with people with more power, since we're talking about that power dynamic and, that control over versus control with? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when I started my career, I worked in consumer marketing at Procter and Gamble, and they gave us jobs where we had a lot of responsibility, but not a whole lot of authority. And so you can't go around telling people what they're going to do. You have to persuade them.
Yeah.
And that means understanding their point of view and their mindset. One of the things I learned there is that communicating with people is not delivering a package of information as accurately as we can, so I can output it and you can input it
Yeah.
into your brain. It's rather, when we had the multiculturalism problems, there was a guy at Virginia, E.D. Hirsch, wrote a book about multiculturalism. He said, we all have mind maps in our head. We make sense of the world by our cumulative experience. And when you're listening, you're fitting that into your view of the world. Okay. And if it doesn't make sense, you hold it in your short-term memory and try to resolve it. And there's some things like that he talks about. But ultimately, he said, you got to know the mind of the person you're talking to. And it's different from a child and a professor.
Yeah.
There's some things on the internet where they explain things at 5 different levels to kind
Yeah.
of explore that idea. But it's not just an objective package of information. It's understanding what someone's capable of hearing,
Yeah.
and accurately understanding. And that's just the basics of communication. So your questions about power, there's not a lot that we can do sometimes when somebody has power over us and won't listen, except change the subject and, change the venue, go work somewhere else.
Yeah.
But I have never wanted to use power as a way of getting what I want. I try to persuade people that work for me why it's the right thing and put the incentives in place to do that. But if they don't do it, then I'll find somebody else that will.
Yeah.
I don't beat them up.
Yeah. And I liked you had said earlier about that friendship and love that you get more done. So how, like as a practical matter for people maybe going, okay, that sounds great, but how do we do that? What are some practical ways we can start to apply that in our life where we show up to create those friendships and come with a more loving approach to be able to have these discussions?
We can start with understanding the role of our subconscious. Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist that talks about this, and he kind of says it's like an elephant and a rider. The elephant is our subconscious, and the rider is the reason, and it kind of pushes the subconscious to, but the subconscious is going to go where it wants. And what it does is it defends our beliefs. This is called confirmation bias, motivational reasoning, where we are not listening to make an impartial decision. We're basically listening to reassure ourselves that we're right and they're wrong. Okay. And so if we recognize this process that's going on in our brains, that's natural, it's evolved, but it produces some bad outcomes in terms of conflict. Yeah. Usually it's right in terms of intuition and things like that, and it's shortcuts going on. But if we recognize our own impulse to defend our beliefs and rather step back and say, let me listen to what you think, and maybe I need to amend my belief, it's much better to start trying to change our own than to change somebody else's. We all know that, right? Yeah. If we don't become friends first, neither one of us is going to budge. We're both going to defend. And one of the metaphors that's used for that is lawyers and military people are defending, right? And when our brains act like lawyers and soldiers more than they do like scouts or judges.
Mm,
A scout better not have a fixed mindset because they may overlook something that's going to kill the platoon tomorrow, right? You got to be open to where you might be wrong. So
mm,
scout mindset is what one author has called this whole
yeah.
orientation on things.
I like that. I like that. We need to be teaching that to all the lawyers out there, frankly, because it is a problem with that approach to life, and we're seeing it ripple over into everyday relationships more than ever. And you talked about that listening piece, and I'd love if we could go a little bit deeper on that, because I think we don't listen well in North America in particular. I think we are not very skilled at listening. You mentioned about we're sort of waiting for our turn to speak. We're rolling over in our head, and we're waiting for the opportunity to convince about the rightness of our position, as opposed to even trying to truly figure out what the other person wants. What do they need, which is sometimes totally compatible with what we're trying to get. So what are your thoughts on that?
Your question reminds me of the experience I had in a physical therapy appointment. Of all places, I was there by this young guy that was college age, and we struck up a conversation. And he told me that he had a class where they assigned a problem, and they said, you cannot make a statement. You just have to ask questions.
I
And he
love
said it
that.
so dramatically reoriented the whole experience.
Yeah.
And so you learn things about people you thought you knew and did, and
Yeah.
you can answer those kind of things yourself. But the whole idea of a discovery mindset, I'm out there to understand, and even if we don't come to agreement, maybe I understand why you think the way you do and prefer the way that you do, and I'm happy for you to live that way as long as you don't make me
Yeah.
live that way, right?
Yeah.
That's what I mean by disagreement is not the problem, it's coercion is the
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah. And I love when you said discovery. I think that's really important, right? I often talk about the art of curiosity. Like when we come, and that exercise is beautiful, by the way. I hadn't heard that, where you're only allowed to ask questions. That dramatically shifts the paradigm of the conversation, right? I mean,
Yes, right.
when we force ourselves to start asking, the more questions we ask, the more information we get, the more that opens up the opportunity for other questions and discovery, as you say, to be able to learn. And one of the things I often advocate, I call it elevated active listening. We talk a lot about, reflecting back what the person has said. But again, I think we often do it just sort of paying lip service to it. Oh, I hear you saying blah, blah, blah. And I really encourage people to reflect back what the person has said, but in even more gracious terms than they did. Like, make their argument better than they did. And I find when you're dealing with really difficult people, that can be a game changer. When I present back let me just make sure I've understood what you said. And I present back all of the points that they've made and their concerns in a way that's even more elegant and articulate than they did. It typically stops them in their tracks, right? It opens the space to have those deeper conversations. What are
Yeah.
your experience
Oh,
around
it's fantastic. I have a quote in my book from John Stuart Mill, an English philosopher of the
that?
1800s, and he says, somebody that understands only their own side of an issue doesn't understand even half of the problem, right? Unless you can state the other guy's view in words that he will accept. Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah,
You're not positioned to resolve anything.
yeah. Yeah. And
But I mean,
interestingly, it triggers reciprocity, I find as well, right? Like when I'm going to be totally intent on hearing you and understanding you and reflecting it back in the most gracious way possible,
yeah.
it typically triggers that reciprocity. And now you've got that space, as you say, where there's that mutual respect to be able to have a better discussion about it.
It's a fundamental impulse though that we have is to reciprocate. There's a book called Persuasion, and they talk about how there's a religious sect that will give you flowers in the airport, then they want a donation.
Yeah.
They're playing on reciprocity.
Yeah, that's
Once
true.
they've given you something, it's our natural inclination to give back. And
That's
it's
true.
embarrassing if we don't, and they put you in a very awkward position of accepting something without reciprocating. And
Yeah.
so yes, that reciprocity is a basic psychological process.
Yeah.
And that's what, to me, this is what we mean by respect. If you just
Yeah.
try to understand and listen and give someone credit for not being, the way I like to put it is, our opponents are not stupid and they're not evil.
Yeah.
Okay. And in big elections, there's tens of millions of them that think that way. You just can't dismiss them as stupid or evil. Why do they think that way?
Yeah.
And how can I get closer to being in harmony with them, not
Yeah.
fighting them?
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, and one of my models, I call it no fear, and I think that reflects they're not all idiots, and we're all driven by our deepest, our fears, our ego, our attachment to certain ideas based on our experiences, our reactivity. So being able to to think about that in advance. Okay, what are the fears that this person's likely bringing to the table? What is underlying this really strong position and conviction that they're holding to so tightly? And when you truly get curious about trying to understand that, again, it opens space for a very different kind of conversation than trying to ram your agenda down their throat and tell them why they're wrong, right? Why their views are wrong.
Yeah. One way I've heard of putting this is that your opponents don't necessarily hate what you love. And if that's true, they love something else that's in tension with what we
Yes.
love.
Yeah.
And that's that, here you're pretty quickly to a deep trade-off.
Yeah.
How do we, and once you begin to think this way, you see it everywhere. I see it several times a day in the newspaper.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a trade-off between force and persuasion
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Here's
And
a
the
trade-off between comfort and adventure.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so true. And this idea about deep trade-offs, I mean, it strikes me, and I'd be interested on your thoughts. It's your book and your baby, obviously. But this, we're talking more about sort of a lot of politics and political views and sort of global issues. But it strikes me these principles apply equally in our personal lives, in our relationship with our intimate partner, with our kids, with service providers that we deal with. What's your experience or your expectation about how your book can be applied out there?
I think you've said it. It applies to marriages, to children, to friends. It's how we get along with one another.
Yeah.
And once we think about it, it's not that hard to see this. It's not like this is a blinding insight. So that's some people's objection. I already knew that. One person said it's like seeing the nose on my face. I know it's there, and if I look, I can see it, but I'm not thinking about it. I'm reacting in these other ways.
Yeah.
And my friends and enemies are reacting in these other ways.
Yeah.
And so if we just think about it a little bit differently, we got a chance to do it better.
Yeah. And there's the key, right? Thinking about it. And it's one of the, I really agonized over whether to even use the term negotiation, in my book and my programs, because people immediately box, much like I'm sure your concepts, they think, oh, this is for politics or for the global scene. And I really want to invite people, and for our listeners out there, think of all of these as a negotiation. Reframe how you look at negotiation, right? So that you are more intentional. And as Mike is saying, that you think about these things. So if you're going to sit down with your kids or your intimate partner and have a potentially difficult conversation, don't just wait and then have it blow up because you haven't been intentional about it in the same way that you would if this was a business issue or discussion. I think if we bring that more intentionality about asking questions, getting creative, bringing empathy to the table, all of the kinds of things you've shared with us here today, Mike, we're going to be able to negotiate better lives, richer relationships. So,
legislatures are negotiation places for negotiation. A parliament, in the English term, parley means to talk, right? And so it's a place. It's a place to negotiate. And our government was set up to emphasize that branch of government. The executive was smaller, the judicial was smaller and impartial, right? But the parliament is where this is supposed to take place. And that's really not functioning well in our country because all of these bad habits are affecting their ability to talk one another and live with each other and respect one another, have a drink, know each other's kids. They go home at so they're just not doing this very well. And if you and your audience have been thinking about negotiation for long, this is about searching for what somebody else really wants. How can they get it while I get what I want?
Yeah.
One example, I write it early in my book. I don't like universal minimum wages. Basically about how all laws, one size doesn't fit all. Right? You can't have a universal minimum wage. The same thing in New York as in rural Wyoming, as in China, as in Nepal, as in space, it doesn't work. It's pretty obvious. Well, I thought this was pretty obvious, and I was willing to put my foot down that this is a bad idea. When he said, "Oh, your book is about balance and equivocation and seeing the other side," and here you say minimum wages are a bad idea.
Oh, that.
So I had to think about it, and I actually went and reworded it for a future edition to say, look, people that want minimum wages are looking for human dignity.
Yeah.
Maybe there's ways we can give them human dignity without insisting that everybody gets paid the same.
Yeah.
Because that's not going to work.
And there's another key that you've just hit on. That's when we come so attached to our ideas or one idea about what the outcome should be. So often in my career, and I think we see it play out on the global scene as well, there is a beautiful solution that's sitting right there on the table, but they're so fixed in their positions, they don't see it. They don't have the space to be able to see that outcome, to be able to think differently by getting, sort of creative and maybe there's a totally different outcome that you hadn't ever contemplated that's better. I come thinking I want X, you want Y, and we assume that one of us is going to get it or we'll have to split the baby. But in fact, there's this outcome that's way up here that's better than X or Y. So I'd
We're,
love,
we're,
yeah, go
we're
ahead.
talking,
Sorry.
we're talking about being open-minded and reframing things, right? That has
Yeah.
obvious benefits in reaching these solutions. There's a trade-off with that. And a future chapter is going to be about open versus closed, right? There are things that we need to be closed about, our commitment to our spouses, right? I'm not always, how being in a room at a party where somebody's always looking over your shoulder, can I find somebody that's better, more beneficial, advantageous to talk to? That, being closed in some circumstances, Anthony Bourdain, who I wouldn't exactly call a conservative, if anyone knows him, as this chef, had a big drug problem and all this stuff. He talked about the benefits of comfort in a place that he knew, a kitchen that he knew, he closed. He didn't want, and so even with open-mindedness and reframing things, there's a trade-off with discomfort. Right?
Yeah. Well, and that opens a whole way. We'll have to come back and have a discussion about, because as you were saying that, I was thinking even the whole quantum physics now, even, is our sense of time even something that's open, right? I mean, it raises all kinds of possibilities.
I do talk about that in the book because basically truth is tentative. And it always is subject to change, even scientific truths. So you had Newton, who found the forces of gravity, and well, that doesn't work at the cosmic level. We have different rules for gravity there. It doesn't work at the quantum level, Newton, but it works at that framework that he saw things. He didn't have the technology to see space or the atom. So he wasn't wrong for his time and space. A lot of religious truths are like that. They were right for the time and space, but we need to adapt them and understand what those people were getting at and the way they saw the world, and give them credit for being intelligent people rather than superstitious,
Yeah. And just being open to it. I mean, gosh, as you were saying that, my mind was just firing off all the examples. I mean, think about what we did to people who proposed the concept that maybe the earth was not flat, right? Or that that the sun didn't revolve around the earth, in fact. I mean, we crucified them. And what is truth in one time may not be truth for all time as our knowledge expands, our awareness expands. And I think such an important and should be obvious thing to keep in mind when we're in conflict today, and yet we don't, right? And we're so, even during COVID, when everybody's like, well, the doctors say X, or so-and-so says X, or it's like, yes, and look through history. They also said this 100 years ago or 200 years ago. I mean, we can't ever just assume that one position is the be all end all for all time and all place. Now, what do you see as the key reasons that negotiations fail?
I need to think about this. Lack of receptiveness to someone else's point of view is an obvious place to start, right? Sometimes my second chapter is on ideals, imagination and reality. Okay. And so I ran across this great quote that the permanent defeat of life is to give up your dreams for reality, right? The permanent opportunity in life is to make your reality into your dreams, right? So this is a big trade-off in how much do we live in the abstract world of possibility and improvement. And some people want no government. Some people want no fossil fuels. You can't reconcile all of these different visions of the way things ought to be. And so one of the reasons negotiations fail may be just sheer incompatibility of visions. I want there to be no automated transport in the world. I want to go to something else, and you need to make a living. And that's what's available now, right? So those are the two things that occur to me is unreceptiveness to alternatives and incompatible visions.
I like your thought process, Mike. You are such a deep thinker and you bring different perspectives to the table. It's been such an interesting conversation, and our time has gone so quickly. And I normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts you've had in your life? You had already shared one aha moment that you had. Do you have something else you'd like? It doesn't have to be on this topic at all. Just one of those aha moments where you think about things differently.
My wife and I are religiously active. I was not as a child and in college. She was more interested in me, and I just went along with her. And over time, I've come to respect the religious impulse a lot more. And we're Presbyterian, which tends to be a little bit less literal about things.
Yeah.
But the beauty of the poetry and the symbolism, which is a kind of a different language.
Yeah.
And I respect a lot of what people had to say. And I understand that they had erroneous ideas of science and things like that.
Yeah.
But I'm much more open to religious ideas and understanding them as part of this role of the imagination. What are the things that we can't measure that we and actually in my book on truth, on chapter 3 on honesty and deception, I talk about truth being of two kinds: scientific truth that corresponds to evidence.
Yeah.
But there's no evidence in religion.
Yeah.
In metaphysical things, you can't measure hope and love and friendship. So that's about coherence. How do we put together beliefs that are coherent and make sense to us about things we can't measure?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a beautiful insight. And even taking it to the next level, like that, just having that openness and receptivity to exploring all religion. Because it always amazes me that at their core, most religions have fundamentally those same strong values and principles. And yet they've warred for generation after generation, right? That, like, again, maybe that control or coercion versus that openness to recognize that these principles are actually really consistent
Right.
so
Yeah.
in all the ways that matter.
Yeah, I like a religion that's not too dreamy, that all this can be reconciled, but human nature is what it is. And
Yeah,
there's nastiness and conflict, and
yeah,
we have to be honest about that and deal
yeah,
with it
yeah.
transparently.
Well, what a great way to end, because what a great reason to grab your book and consume it and share it. So where can people learn more about you, Mike?
It's on Amazon. It's called Deep Tradeoffs. If you search for that, there's not a whole lot of competition for that. I do have a website that links to Amazon. That's the main way to get the book. You can reach me through a little mechanism on the website if
Yeah.
someone has a question they want to pursue, or write me at mike@deeptradeoffs.com.
Gorgeous. And we'll make sure for our listeners to have all of that in the show notes as well. Obviously, you've got just a little taste of it here about what a deep thinker Mike is and what a difference it would make if we all approach life, maybe asking a little more of those questions. So thanks so much for joining us today, Mike, and sharing your really quite insightful impressions. Thanks.
Thank you. It's been a delight.
And for our listeners, I have no doubt there was so much value in this episode. Make sure to give the gift of sharing. Share this episode with other people who you think could benefit. And frankly, in today's polarized world, we could all benefit from some new thinking on how to interact with each other, and coming from that place of friendship and love as sort of the foundational starting point. And before we sign off today, wanted to share some ways we can work together. If you're looking to uplevel your negotiation skills so you can negotiate your best life, I've got everything from online to group to my VIP and mastermind experiences available to help you leverage your innate natural power to be able to negotiate your best life to get more of what you want and deserve. And if that sounds interesting, check it out at Art of Feminine Negotiation. Make sure to grab my book of the same name if you haven't done that yet, Art of Feminine Negotiation. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.